Hello everyone, welcome to the 2020 Veterans Day Online Assembly. Though we cannot have the Veterans Day Assembly in person, we are super excited to have a virtual event. We will be starting the assembly with the national anthem.
Hey veterans, I would just like to say I'm very thankful for your service and sacrifices.
Thank you to all our veterans for everything you do for our country.
Thank you, veterans, for all your service and sacrifices.
Thank you to all the veterans who risked their lives to make sure that we have a free country and a safe world.
Happy Veterans Day to all the veterans. It's such a blessing to live in such a beautiful country where so many people have served and sacrificed their lives for our freedom. And thank you to my grandpa. It's such an honor to be in your family. Thank you so much for serving.
Thank you, veterans.
Jerry Coy served in the U.S. Air Force for 20 years, reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. In total, he flew 330 combat missions in Vietnam and 100-plus missions as aggressor and red flag exercises. Jerry's pilot career lasted for 40 years in military fighters and commercial aviation. He has instructed on every aircraft that he has ever flown, both as a pilot and classroom instructor. It is my honor to introduce Mr. Coy.
Hello, folks from Raisbeck High School. I would like to first thank Whitaker and Ava for setting this up. I hope you find it interesting, and I'll do my best. In terms of a little bit of history about myself before we get going through the presentation today, I was a fighter pilot for 20 years in the Air Force, and then an airline pilot for 20 years at Northwest Airlines. The airplanes that I have flown in an order are of course, the pilot training aircraft, the T-37 and the T-38. My first assignment was to Southeast Asia. Most people just call it Vietnam. I was a forward air controller with the 5th Special Forces. Those are Green Berets. I lived on a small camp with the Green Berets, and I had my own airplane there. There were actually quite a few of us, 8 pilots and 9 aircraft. And they were flying the O-2A, which is a twin-engine Cessna aircraft that we would use to support the Green Berets, directing airstrikes, doing search and rescue, and just the general production of wartime fighting. Subsequent to that, back to be a T-38 instructor in the Air Training Command for 2 years, then into the F-4, assigned to Homestead Air Force Base. I was there for about 6 months, and then I took an opportunity for a request to have some augmentees to Southeast Asia in the F-4. I was there for 2.5 months, back to Homestead Air Force Base, and then from there up to Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, still flying the F-4. I did transition into the E model F-4, which was the last of the production models. Next, I was assigned to the aggressors at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. There, I was a dissimilar air combat training instructor, and I did that job for about 4 years, flying not only at Nellis in large force exercises called Red Flag, but also traveled every month to different fighter bases to fly against fighter pilots on their own terrain. And subsequent to that, Saudi Arabia is an advisor of the Saudi Air Force, continuing to fly the F-5 in that job. I helped the Saudis set up their own aggressor squadron. Back to the United States and to the the F-15 at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, where I was operations officer and subsequent the commander of the 8th Attack Fighter Squadron, and retired from that position. 8 days after retirement, I went to work at Northwest Airlines and worked there for 20 years flying the 727, and then for 18 and a half of those 20 years, the 747. So quite a long history of 40 years of being a pilot, 20 of those in a job that was really fun, 20 of those in a job that was somewhat boring, but nonetheless paid the bills. Now to the presentation. We're going to be talking about the Granville brothers of Springfield, Massachusetts. Although the company was short-lived, 1929 to 1934, they actually produced quite a few aircraft that were notable. The one in the slide that you see in front of you, of course, is the model that sits in the Museum of Flight. Now, this originally they had it on the floor of the Museum of Flight. Subsequently, they've hung it from the ceiling, and it is actually in a hard bank turned from the ceiling there. The Granville brothers, Zanford, Thomas, Robert, Mark, and Edward, were from a very large family, and they actually had a sister as well. So there were 6 kids in the family. Zanford was the first to leave home. He left home as a 17-year-old and became known as Granny. I think it was just a short form of Granville, not because he was much older than any of the other kids. So they grew up in Madison, New Hampshire on a farm, and at age 19, he actually started working in a Chevrolet repair garage near the East Boston Airport. That airport later became known as Logan, and those of you that have ever been to Boston know that it is a massive airport now on an international scale. Now, by age 23, Granny had formed his own car company, or car garage, I should say, actually, and it was adjacent to the airport. So as a result of being so close to the airport, he was frequently asked to work on aircraft engines, and actually started as a full-time aircraft mechanic in 1925, only 2 years after forming his own car garage. He did something that was pretty unique for the age. He formed his own mobile garage by making his garage out of a truck. So he customized the inside of the truck to carry all of his equipment so he could service the aircraft on the ramp, as opposed to have those aircraft moved to another site for the work to be performed. He actually got interested in flying by seeing all the airplanes in the area take off and land and fly around, and actually got his own pilot's license in 1927. Now, he had hoped to start his own aircraft company at the Logan Airport, but could find no space available. So he actually moved his garage to Springfield, Massachusetts, and started Granville Brothers Aircraft Company in an old dance hall in 1929. Over the period of the next year or so, he actually recruited all of his brothers to come and work with him. And in March of 1929, they were all there by that time. This is notable because market crash happened in October of 1929. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the market crash of 1929, it was the worst financial disaster in the history of the world. Not only did this country crash and end up basically with millions of people out of work, but it actually was worldwide. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make there is that this was a heck of a time to be trying to start your own aircraft company. Now, in 1929, Granny actually, with his brothers and a fellow that he had gotten to know who was into aircraft design, actually designed and built the first of the Granville aircraft known as the Model A. It was a traditional biplane with a small radial engine, only rated at 100 horsepower. Now, the airplane was ready to fly, and Granny had ordered a parachute so that he could test fly the airplane himself, but have a parachute on board in case he had problems. He got the parachute delivery was delayed, and Granny got impatient and actually took the airplane up without a parachute. He did it at night, however, so that if there were problems, nobody would witness the disaster. The airplane performed perfectly, and he was able to land that evening and come back. Now, the airplane was unique in the regard that due to limited leg room, they actually put the control stick on the side of the aircraft, the side of the cockpit, I should say, so that it could accommodate longer legs into the cockpit area. Side-by-side seating, he actually took the airplane to a air meet in 1929, May of that year in Springfield, Mass., and was seeking investors to actually get behind his aircraft and his company. And he actually was able to interest a number of investors, the most significant of which were the Tate brothers, who had a huge milk business, and they invested $25,000 into the Granville company. The Model A was produced in 9 models, and all were sold. Now, referring back to the crash of 1929, by 1930, times were desperate, and the Granville company was no exception. So at the time, air races were very popular and actually had large purses for finishing high in the order of participants. So in order to enter the American Flying Derby, the Granville brothers produced the Model X, X standing for experimental. And here's a fairly decent picture of it. Notice it's got wire bracing for struts for the wings. And it's a small airplane, 23.5-foot wingspan, and a very small vertical stabilizer. Powered by a Cirrus inline 4-cylinder engine rated at 115 horsepower. Now, the reason that the Cirrus engine was used were they were the sponsors of the All-American Flying Derby, and it was a requirement to have one of their engines in your aircraft to be a participant. Lowell Bales was the pilot of the Model X and actually finished second, winning a purse of $7,000, maintaining a 116-mile-an-hour average in the race. Now, it doesn't sound like a whole lot of money now, $7,000, but it equated to about $250,000 at the time, if it were in today's money. Success of the Model X led to the production of the following B, C, and D models. Remember, he had produced the A, which was side-by-side seating. Now, these are single-seat aircraft. The first of which, the B, ended up being sold to Spain, and this is speculated that that's actually who bought the aircraft for the Spanish Civil War. It had that same Monasco Pirate 4-cylinder engine, which was an inverted air-cooled engine. It had a restricted certificate, though, by the Department of Commerce. It can only be used for special purposes, such as air shows and, I guess, warfighting in Spain. Models B and C were similar, but they had wheel shocks. The airplane that you see in front of you actually used the rubber tires for shock absorption on landing. Model C, only one built again, and this was what they called their cross-country aircraft. They added a baggage compartment with a load limit of 10 pounds. Every time that I do this, I start to laugh out loud thinking about they didn't know my wife when they thought a 10-pound baggage limit would get anybody anywhere. Model D, as you can notice, the design changes quite a bit here. It has now a supercharged inline engine producing 150 horsepower. And in order to get an unrestricted certificate from the Department of Commerce, they had to increase the vertical stabilizer size, which they did, and entered the Cleveland Air Races in 1931, flown by a designer, Bob Hall, who actually helped with the design of the aircraft. And it actually won first in class. Class at the time was based on horsepower of the engine. And it won the Williams Trophy. Notice, if you will, a distinctive feature which carried out through all the rest of the GB aircraft, and that is the wheel fairings, affectionately called pants. 31, with their success in some air racing here, they decided that we need to go farther with this and try to concentrate on air racing, since there were no passenger aircraft being purchased at the time. So this led to the Model E. Still has those wire braces for struts. And they went back to a radial engine because the radials of the ear were producing more horsepower than the inline engines. Additionally, you didn't have to carry the extra weight of glycol in a radiator. The airplane that you see here was powered by the Warner Scarab and rated at 110 horsepower. Notice, if you will, max airspeed of 189 miles an hour, which was really quite fast for the era. The wingspan 25 feet, which was exactly what the other aircraft I just showed you had, and was quite successful. The E led to the development of the Y, which, as you can see from the picture, actually had tandem seating, and it actually had a wider wingspan and was a longer aircraft, 25 feet long versus the 18 feet. And they produced 2 of these. It was actually built on request from Lycoming Engines to use as a test bed for their Lycoming radios, beg your pardon. The Granvilles kept one of these as a company aircraft as well. So one of them to Lycoming and one stayed with the Granville brothers. Now, the airplane that we see in the museum is the Model Z, powered by a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr., rated at 525 horsepower. Notice, if you will, they got rid of those wire struts. And the logic behind that is pretty simple. They create drag. These guys are into going as fast as they can possibly go for air racing, and tried to streamline the aircraft any way they possibly could. Notice it still has the distinctive wheel pants there for wheel fairings. Designer of the aircraft was Bob Hall, who later joined Grumman and designed practically all of the fighter aircraft that were built by Grumman during World War II. The Z model, from 5 weeks from design to flight, is pretty spectacular for anyone that's ever tried to build an airplane. And optimizing the physical theory of body passing through liquid using a 3 to 3.5 optimization. Now, what that means is the radial engine, the diameter of the radial engine being a 3 to 3.5, meaning that the tail of the airplane should be like a 1 in terms of diameter. And wind tunnel testing proved that they had achieved this as well as they possibly could. Now, the engine fairing also met the criteria of the current technology of the era to not only increase engine cooling, but to also expedite the or smooth flow the airplane through the air. This wingspan, as opposed to the one that I just showed you, is 23.5 feet. Very narrow. Notice that the cockpit position is fairly far aft on the aircraft, and the reason for that, of course, is center of gravity considerations. The fuel is forward of the pilot up over the wings themselves, and in wind tunnel testing, they moved the wings up, down, and decided somewhere between those two was probably the best place in terms of airflow and being able to maintain the minimum drag possible. Now, the design in terms of whether to make the airplane stable or less stable. Pilots want less stable aircraft because it's more responsive. Engineers tend to want stable aircraft. It goes slower, but is more easy to control. And the decision by the Granville brothers was to go with less stability. The Model Z entered 5 races in 1931, winning all, including the Thompson Trophy, the airplane flown by Lowell Bales, and the Goodyear Trophy won by Bob Hall. 1932, we're still concentrating on air racing because the market crash actually didn't recover fully until the late 30s. So we're still in this really tough financial situation. The